Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Minnick, and I am the Senior Manager of Marketing and Patient Engagement Alliances at CISCRP. I want to welcome you all to today's webinar on eConsent. We have two distinguished presenters with us today. Ken Getz is the founder and board chair of CISCRP, and Eric Delant is the president of Patient Solutions at DrugDev. Before we get started, I have just a few quick housekeeping items to cover. Everyone has been placed on mute upon entry, and I would ask that you please remain on mute for the duration of the call to avoid any noise or sound issues. Please use the chat feature in WebEx to submit your questions. You may send in your questions at any point throughout the webinar, but all questions will be addressed at the end during the Q&A session. Feel free to direct your questions to myself. Again, my name is Rachel Minnick, or you can just send them to everyone in general. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for archive viewing on the CISCRP website. You will receive instructions after the webinar for how to access and view the recording. So without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our first presenter, Ken Getz. And Ken, I'm going to go ahead and hand the ball over to you. And there you go, Ken.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So I just want to say welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to be addressing the full group on this webinar. And I have the great privilege of being able to talk to you about essentially the backdrop of informed consent, sort of setting the stage, if you will, for us. And then I'll be turning it over to Eric, who will speak specifically about eConsent. So I'm just looking to advance the slides here, Rachel, and here we go. So what I'd like to do is really just begin by essentially framing our discussion by talking about the purpose of informed consent, its ultimate purpose, and using patient input to help us understand where we're falling short in the process today. So let's really begin by moving in just a little bit further to understand where the patient input will come from. I'm going to be drawing from two primary sources. The first will be the CISCRP 2015 Perceptions and Insights study. And from that, we've got a lot of good data from a very large sample size describing patient and public attitudes about clinical research and areas where they have or do not have a good understanding about the research process, or where they provide feedback on their experiences. The other area that I want to touch on is a study that CISCRP was involved with in 2014, where we conducted essentially a large-scale meta-analysis-like review of the published literature to draw insights into what ways informed consent interventions and approaches are influencing or impacting and improving patient recruitment and retention, and patient satisfaction in clinical research. And I'll be touching on those as well. So let's discuss directly the intent or purpose of informed consent. And there are two historically and traditionally defined purposes that really come from the Belmont Report and the Code of Federal Regulations. And it really centers around two primary areas, ways that we honor and respect each study volunteer's autonomy and their rights as an individual. And we do this by providing a balanced and informative discussion and requesting their permission to proceed. We provide sufficient information for them to make an informed decision about participating or choosing not to participate in our research. Many have acknowledged, of course, that there are a variety of legal and regulatory needs and requirements that are also met through the informed consent process. But there's a third and what we would consider now a core or essential area that, or purpose that informed consent serves today. And this is one that is really grounded in the entire patient-focused drug development movement, the whole patient centricity and patient engagement arena, where informed consent is really viewed as a dynamic process or a dynamic principle that ultimately supports patient engagement and reinforces and nurtures a higher level of partnership that will exist between the research professional and the patient or study volunteer in the study. And if we accept this third principle or purpose, we see that the informed consent process and we must recognize that it begins before the individual is participating in a trial, continues during their participation, and even continues after participation has ended on the specific trial. All of the informed consent process, in essence, is now following the individual as they are moving along their health journey. And it's critical for us to recognize that we must inform them at each step along the process, and their being informed is dependent on the unique position where they are and and what are the unique pieces of information that we need to provide to guide them along this journey and to continue to help them to become informed and to feel that they're empowered through their education about the research process and their role in that process. So let's begin by looking at public preparedness to participate in clinical research, public knowledge and how informed the public might be. And we can look again at the, as I mentioned earlier, the CISCRP 2015 study. And we see that in self-reports, the public believes that their general knowledge about clinical research is quite high, approaching 80% of the total respondents in this particular survey, and also a similarly high percentage, 75% tell us that they would be willing to participate. What's interesting is when you begin to dig deeper, however, you begin to see that this high-level understanding is very conceptual. This self-reported general knowledge or level of feeling informed is at that conceptual level and has not really been internalized. Typically, the public does not have a very close relationship or a detailed understanding of the research process. A high percentage, for example, don't know that clinical trials are performed on nearly all commercial medical interventions, for example. Here are a few other interesting statistics. Research America conducted a study asking the American public if they could identify a single living scientist, and the vast majority said no. Of those who could identify a living scientist, 27%, the most commonly mentioned individual was Sanjay Gupta of CNN, as he's their medical correspondent. So the media plays a really important part, and our media-oriented culture plays an important part in providing education at this level. A very high percentage of the public cannot tell you where clinical research is conducted, and they can't name a research center or place where research is performed. And the list goes on, really showing, again, a very high level of conceptual recognition of clinical research, but it doesn't really translate into being informed about the details of clinical research. So it's a very, if you will, cursory view, a non-internalized view of the clinical research space. Once an individual moves into a place where they're starting to consider participation for themselves or for someone else, that's when they begin to really start to internalize and personalize the information that they will need to understand to become more informed in this process. And in so many studies, including this CISCRP 2015 study, we've seen that at this level, there are a variety of areas of information where the public and prospective volunteers tell us they would like to learn more, that they consider important information that will influence their decision. It revolves around a number of key areas, as you would expect. The research itself and the purpose of the scientific study, the logistics of the trial, its location, how convenient the study might be, the value of participation to themselves, what they may receive in exchange for their participation, and in this case, a fairly high percentage would like to receive a summary of their study results after their participation has ended, but also if there are any potential reimbursements or compensation, how it might benefit other patients who may be suffering from the illness, et cetera. So again, this is really beginning to signal the internalization and more of a personal approach to the kind of information that will be needed to inform a prospective volunteer. Informed consent form review is but a small part of the broader informed consent process, though it's the area that we typically focus on the most because it's a very tangible event that must occur, that is required to occur in every clinical trial. CISCRP has conducted a number of studies to get close to this specific process, the form review. And a couple of interesting statistics I'll share with you. 60% of study volunteers, for example, tell us that they read the informed consent by themselves or with a family member and then reviewed it with study staff. And this varies by geographic area to a significant degree, where we see a higher percentage of patients or study volunteers in South America and Asia Pacific reviewing the form initially with the principal investigator. About 10% of study volunteers tell us that they never reviewed the form with anyone else, and a higher percentage indicate that they did so in other countries. And this may be a function of the environment with which they've been presented with the informed consent form. It might have to do with their ability to actually read the informed consent information and their comfort level reading it with another individual present. About 1 in 7 overall find the informed consent form difficult to understand, and that number is rising steadily. It actually is approaching now 1 in 5 when we look at it in aggregate, 1 in 7 in North America. And again, it's growing, it's rising, and it very much in tandem with the increasing complexity of our protocol designs. And we do see a lot of variability here as well, where a much higher proportion of study volunteers who've reviewed the informed consent form find it difficult to understand in South America, in Eastern Europe, and in the Asia-Pacific regions. And this may be associated with a number of factors. It may have to do with the language translations, misalignment of the form with the widely varying levels of education or the conditions under which the informed consent form is reviewed in many of these geographic areas. We do a generally good job in terms of comprehension of the informed consent form. A very high percentage, 60 to as much as 80%, indicate that they had a generally high level of comprehension when we tested, and over 85% tell us that they were somewhat satisfied or very satisfied with the informed consent review process. A high percentage indicate that they felt that their questions were answered to their satisfaction, but we do see some variability by geographic area and also by age. And this may be due to a number of factors. It may have to do with, again, the customization of the language, the translations, and also the delivery formats in which the informed consent form material or narrative was provided. Interestingly, although we saw that roughly 20% find the informed consent form difficult to understand, and we know that our informed consent forms are getting longer and have a lot more detail, again mirroring a rising complexity in our protocol design. We see that for the most part, a very high percentage, half, even after going through the informed consent form review, tell us that they would be somewhat or more willing to participate. And this is a bit of a counterintuitive observation that comes from our 2013 Perceptions and Insights study. Why do they say that they're more willing to participate after going through what some perceive as a difficult process and what most recognize as a very detailed or detail-oriented review process? We think in some ways the difficulty itself is associated with more rigorous and complex science, which for some is a signal that this is important science that is being conducted. It may also have to do with the time and attention that the study staff place in dedicating themselves to trying to answer questions that may be associated with this more rigorous science. So it's an interesting relationship between willingness to participate after going through a lengthy and what some may perceive as a difficult process. We can look at a number of areas now, and we'll shift our attention to the results of some of the meta-analysis. This is now based on a review of hundreds of articles that have appeared in peer-reviewed literature. In some cases, I'll call out the actual primary or first author for some of the papers. In other cases, I've just provided a summary, but you can send us an email, and I'm happy to send you more detailed information. Here we're looking at informed consent interventions, extending discussion, improving the layout and the format of the informed consent form, and the use of multimedia on improving comprehension. And what you see is that so many factors don't necessarily improve comprehension, in part because overall that's one area where even the traditional paper-informed consent form has been generally effective. Extending discussions, improving the layout, and the use of multimedia have shown some places where there's been medium improvement. Layout improvements for 2 studies demonstrated high impact on comprehension. So the layout really looks like it does play an important role, perhaps a more important role as an intervention on comprehension than these 2 other areas that have been studied here. What is the informed consent, different interventions and their impact on satisfaction? Well, we see that so many areas don't necessarily impact improvements in satisfaction, but they do have an impact on decreasing the level of satisfaction. For example, putting time pressures on this study volunteer to review the information more quickly, providing insufficient detail, creating an interactive environment that feels more anxious, where not enough detail is provided. Questions aren't necessarily responded to appropriately, or the environment doesn't feel right. All of those areas have the effect of lowering satisfaction with the informed consent process. And again, intuitively, many of the areas that seem to most improve satisfaction relate most specifically to the nature of the discussion. Was it patient? Was it attentive? Was it more open? These are all areas that are associated with a higher level of satisfaction. What are some of the areas or interventions that have had an effect, a measured effect on enrollment performance? This is an area where we find that custom-tailored approaches tend to be associated with increased enrollment levels and really point to the need to customize based on a particular a patient subgroup or even some of the individual needs, self-paced learning, for example, the use of different technologies that may be appropriate for a younger audience, or the use of larger print and different formats that may be appropriate for an older community. These types of customization approaches appear to be associated with increased enrollment levels. But a lot of the other areas, as you see, don't necessarily improve enrollment effectiveness, but may have the opposite effect of harming enrollment performance, and those have a lot to do with the length of the informed consent form. And we come right back to a point that I'd made earlier, the lack of prior knowledge. And this really speaks to the need to focus on informing our prospective study volunteers and the public before they're in the window where they're reviewing a specific informed consent form. Again, recognizing that we have the responsibility to inform individuals throughout their health journey before, during, and after they enter the research enterprise. One other area that I want to touch on is an interesting finding that we also drew from the 2013 Perceptions and Insights study. And what this really showed us is that so many of the elements of a positive informed consent experience are associated with retention rates. So here we're looking at two different groups, those who completed studies with an N of over 1,300 and those who dropped out. And you can see that dropouts, those individuals who ended or terminated their involvement prematurely had a higher level of difficulty understanding the informed consent form. They were frustrated, more frustrated with the lack of their questions being answered, and they reported poor levels of comprehension. And we continue to see other places where we can tie the outcome of informed consent form review with a study volunteer retention, and if we connect that even further to those individuals who are coming into the informed consent process right at the outset and being more informed, we believe that that will ultimately play into higher retention rates. One very strong area where that is really a missed opportunity for us today is following the informed consent process through the end of clinical research participation, and we also see an opportunity to improve the informed consent process while the study is underway. If you look at the left-hand side of this chart, you see that nearly 40% of study volunteers enrolled in a study report that they either never received an update about the trial and what is being learned about the study, or only received one update. And many have looked at this statistic and see it as a potential indication that there's more that we can do just to provide ongoing feedback about the study, the appropriate feedback just to continue to support engagement. About 90% of study volunteers tell us that they would like to receive the results of their study, and a similar percentage tell us that after they completed their study, they never received any information and never had any further interaction with study staff. So there's a huge opportunity to return clinical trial results summaries and to maintain a connection with our study volunteers as part of their ongoing education, the ongoing informed consent dynamic that we can support long after their participation in a single trial has ended. Our experience at CISCRP in supporting the return of trial results summaries has really helped, we think, sort of shape the return of trial results into one of the top areas where we see a number of companies piloting or implementing initiatives today. In fact, the return of trial results, according to a recent study conducted by the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, it is now one of the top 3 most implemented initiatives. Many of the top initiatives, including the return of trial results, are becoming more popular because they're easy to implement, they're relatively inexpensive, and they have a high impact on satisfaction rates, and many have found on improving retention. So I'm now going to turn it over to Eric, and I just want to leave you with two key takeaways. Patient input into the purpose and the process of informed consent really suggests many places where there can be improvements to the process. And we see a number of places where the informed consent process could really have a major impact if we continue to support it and improve it on volunteer satisfaction and on improving enrollment rates. So I thank you, and I'll now turn it over to you, Rachel, who will in turn turn it over to Eric.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. And I am now making Eric the presenter. Eric, are you able to advance the slides?
I am, I think. Can you hear me okay, Rachel?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. And I think you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Great, great. So thank you so much, Ken. And not only thank you for today's presentation, which was extremely insightful, but thank you also for all of the work that you and CISCRP have done to illuminate everything that we know, and it advises so much of what our solutions do, and I think what everyone else does, as well as just ongoing respect for patients in general. So thank you very much for that. As Ken mentioned, I'm going to focus primarily on eConsent and its effect on participant comprehension, retention, and engagement as we go through some of this. So first, I think some of the data that Ken pointed out shows that, the individual interventions that we looked at, whether it's extended discussion or multimedia, that by themselves, they don't necessarily have a huge impact. And I think for that reason, most of the eConsent solutions that are available are going to take a multifaceted approach. I'm going to use some of the data points that Ken pointed out, as well as some others, but one thing that's also important to understand is that eConsent adoption and use in general is still quite new compared to paper. So I think the jury might still be out a little bit in terms of really hardcore evidence that shows this, but I think through correlation and through common sense and looking at how about things that we do know about eConsent, we'll be able to see some benefits. And primarily, I think we see benefits in a multifaceted approach that might include multimedia, that includes techniques like progressive disclosure, which are demonstrated adult learning techniques, where rather than showing a whole bunch of information at once, we do one idea at a time. And we'll look at each of these in a second as well. But interactivity is also a component. So in the FDA guidance for eConsent, which moved from draft guidance to actual guidance in December of last year, they differentiate the idea of eConsent being a PDF document that we just happen to be presenting on a tablet, as opposed to a more interactive experience, which encourages engagement, involvement, a deeper understanding and comprehension in general. It might include things like hyperlinked words that produce definitions, or the concept of tiered consent, where we reduce the amount of information down to the things that are required, while still making it possible for subjects who want to go deeper to find that additional information. For example, most of the eConsent tools that we see now have the ability to indicate or mark or highlight sections of a document that a patient wants to get further information on as they go through it. Especially in longer forms, that sometimes it's difficult for people to remember, oh, I wanted to ask the doctor about this. So giving them tools and giving them the ability to facilitate this process is another feature that we see. It's also possible to do quizzes and self-assessments in an eConsent. So I think we can start to see those elements, along with the ability to track, to produce statistics and metrics around the process, as well as even the ability to analyze a document, are all combined features of eConsent that complement patient comprehension. I think it's also very important for us to differentiate very specifically eConsent from e-signature. So this is something that you often hear about, especially in global studies. There are situations where we're not allowed to use an e-signature, but still are allowed to use eConsent, especially on global studies. And to take this just one step further, I want to reemphasize one of the points that Ken made as well, where informed consent is a process, and we should not be focused so much on the informed consent document, which is ultimately just an artifact that demonstrates that the process took place. And the process needs to start, as Ken pointed out, before the actual participation in the study, during the study, and after the study. And it needs to be complemented with a number of additional elements besides just simply signing the form. The informed consent document is not a contract. Again, it's just simply a vehicle that demonstrates that a proper informed consent process took place. But when we look at all the assets that an eConsent solution brings, then I think we can see that the resulting informed consent document, along with these additional artifacts, are all things that can further complement that process and being able to demonstrate that the process actually did take place or didn't. So, for example, the overall patient workflow in an eConsent process can be broken down into subsets, and each one of these elements can further be documented as kind of an artifact. The idea of introducing a patient to the trial, discussing how the eConsent tool works, perhaps including an introductory video where we might discuss research in general or specific things about the study, or potentially even just simply how to use the tablet. Elements like that can be used. All this could happen before we actually go through the content of the informed consent document, where we can use a technique which I described earlier, the progressive disclosure, where incrementally each concept is presented and considered before moving to the next, as opposed to just, here's a 70-page document, take a look at it and let me know if you have any questions. Those are all things, again, that help put the informed back in the informed consent process. Once that process has happened, we can go to a summary. Potentially, we could go to a quiz and establish a full understanding. Maybe that's a self-assessment as opposed to a test. So it's more of a tool that might help the patient themselves understand if they understood what they just read, as opposed to something that, a test that they have to pass. And again, all these elements are potentially could be mixed and matched to provide the most appropriate solution at the end of the day, depending on the risk, depending on the nature of the study, maybe the schedule, et cetera. And then all this is also going to be followed, of course, by the most important part of informed consent, which is the opportunity for the patient to discuss any questions that they have with a medically competent person who's capable of answering those questions and make sure that all of their questions are answered before they sign. So by virtue of using an electronic informed consent, we can actually track the activity in each one of these steps, apply it to an audit trail, make sure that when we look at this and analyze it, are there parts of the process that are breaking down? Where are the problems happening, and have a more corrective approach to ongoing improvement of the process. So let's look at some of these individual elements specifically. So compared to a paper process where this process has to just be assumed that it was taken, because at the end of the day we just have a piece of paper with a signature on it. In an electronic world, we can use animations, we can use video, we can use audio to enhance the actual experience that a patient has. And while individually these elements might not improve understanding or not improve, as part of a larger collection of elements, we can. So we can obviously present a getting started, an introductory video. We can use animations to present different concepts, making sure that patients understand, for example, randomization or risks or side effects, or the fact that they have the ability to make a decision or choose it, or generally what is informed consent as well. So in addition to these elements, we can also have linked terms and phrases, which when clicked can produce definitions. In our early stages of developing our eConsent tool, we found that in situations, even when people were well educated, that just by exposing some of these things and giving them the ability to maybe clear up some of the questions they might have, that they were more likely to engage in that conversation. And I think ultimately, again, that conversation and that process of interaction between the patient and the person are the important parts of informed consent. And the idea of an eConsent solution replacing that, I think, is perhaps ill-advised, and looking at it more as a tool to enhance that process, document that process, make it more transparent, make it more efficient and more consistent is a more appropriate way to look at that. We mentioned also the idea of progressive disclosure. So in our tool and most of the tools we see, we have the ability to break the document up into sections, and they have some mechanism to indicate that they understood it or that they had a question, and if they have a question, to perhaps highlight where that question is, maybe the nature of that question as well. So this also raises the level of interactivity in terms of their engagement with the actual document. Another observational effect that we see is that we see that patients typically spend more time, potentially because of the fact that they are interacting in this way with the document, as opposed to perhaps just kind of glancing across a paper document. And I attribute that additional time they're spending to perhaps increasing the comprehension that we see. I want to touch briefly on tiered consent. And there's quite a bit of activity in this area. Transcelerate initiative has some descriptions of tiered consent. And the Citigroup out of Duke University also has some documentation, has produced a number of different initiatives to help define and document what tiered consent is. And essentially, tiered consent brings us back to the elements of informed consent that are actually required by federal regulation. It suggests that we don't need to have 8 or 9 pages in the consent form that describe inclusion-exclusion criteria, or describe in excruciating detail every blood draw and how many milligrams or teaspoons it's going to be, elements like that. We can allow that information to be part of it and give the access to that information, but perhaps move away from too much information, which is one of the main complaints we hear from patients, especially those who are facing potentially life-threatening diseases, to get back and focus on the actual mission of informed consent, giving them access to the ability to jump through those things, and also, if they want more information, to go through that. The Citigroup as well recognizes that although tiered consent can certainly be done on paper, that the use of eConsent, if you can imagine the tools, the ability to link out to things, to produce pop-ups, to organize and present information in a more practical way and through different means and different media, are all additionally elements that are probably easier with eConsent than they would necessarily be with paper. Just as a point, this actually parallels some of the points that Ken made earlier, but basically we see the elements that are required of informed consent. And it makes it hard to understand how do we possibly have 70, 60, 50-page documents for informed consent when these are really the elements that we have to cover. Again, I don't want to spend too much time going through all this in excruciating detail right now, but you know, happy to share these slides with you or to go over this with you afterwards, or you know, please feel free to reach out to us for any more details or email us, and we can share more detail around this. But the point here is that these long forms, even though the studies are more complex, we don't necessarily have to have forms that are exceptionally longer or complicated. Obviously, that's going to be contextually relevant. Some studies that are very complicated might require some more information, but there's a balance. Quizzes and self-assessments are another way that we can address and improve comprehension in the use of eConsent. So, for example, after a discussion or perhaps prior to a discussion, a patient can go through. We could ask specific questions, give them different choices. If they get something wrong, we could link them back to more information and perhaps even require that they're able to get the correct answer before they move forward. We often get the questions about, well, what happens? How do you handle patients that don't answer the quiz correctly, or don't get 100% or get less than 100%? I think that's where we start looking at situations like, well, the quiz doesn't necessarily have to be a test that you pass. It's more of a tool that the patient themselves can use to assess their own understanding of something, and whether or not that's data that goes into the audit trail or not are all things that can be discussed. This is a study that was conducted in 2013 that I think helps demonstrate the effects of all those combined interactions, where in 2 different groups, one group actually were study team members, a smaller group. I think the N in that group was 14. That's group 1. And in comparison to group 2, which was a group of 55, so very small numbers. But in this situation, comparing paper consent to electronic informed consent, just asking basic questions about the consent form content, we see, I think, significantly improved scores in the electronic consent groups compared to the paper groups. Again, the N's are small, but this helps us suggest that, hey, this might have a benefit. And I think we're going to see in a year or two, as some of the larger studies that are using electronic informed consent, and they're being done in ways to actually compare them to paper more effectively, that we're going to see more meaningful and more tangible results that will further reinforce this. There are quite a few other studies that help this, and as Ken pointed out, CISCRP has done a lot of work in this area as well to kind of understand the background and what is it that drives patients, and what are the elements of informed consent that perhaps help them or don't help them get through that particular process. Before moving to retention and recruitment, I just want to touch on a little bit of background. So everyone on this call probably knows this, but for the most part, trials do not do a great job of getting to their target enrollments through the trial. And depending on where you look, anywhere from 20% to 30% or higher dropouts occur across general trials. We also see that about half of sites tend to under-enroll. So it's the exception when we have sites that enroll and complete studies to their enrollment. And that there actually is a considerable number of patients that fail to enroll as single patients. And actually one of the CISCRP studies shows us that 90% of trials do meet their enrollment as long as the timelines of the studies are doubled. So all these things start to point to why clinical trials are so expensive, and the fact that we need to do something to improve all of this. This is actually a different view of some of the data that Ken also showed, but for example, if we look specifically at patients who drop out of a study compared to patients who complete the trial, we're going to see a significantly higher percentage, for example, of the patients who dropped out of the trial compared to the patients who did not, who complain about not really understanding the consent form. It was difficult to understand that form. So focusing back on that comprehension statistic is significant. Similarly, or perhaps inversely, we see that patients who were satisfied that their questions were answered, we show a 15%, whatever, 16% group of patients who drop out early who felt that their questions weren't answered. And some of the other data points that were in that slide that Ken showed as well, 12% compared to 1% of patients who drop out felt that they weren't clear about the study purpose, or parts of the study were still not clear in significant comparisons. So this is an important factor for us to look at. It also shows how improving comprehension ultimately could have an impact on the ROI of the cost of eConsent in general. This is an older study, but it suggests that we could screen fewer patients, enroll fewer patients, but arrive at the same number who complete the study. So while I don't think we can say that eConsent improves recruitment, I think we can start to connect the dots and see that eConsent may very well reduce attrition if we accept that one of the main reasons that patients are dropping out is due to a lack of comprehension, that we can start to see a plausible case for eConsent improving retention at the end of the day. So it's possible for us to understand this as well when we look at the insights and the metrics of eConsent. The tools that are possible in eConsent, which are fundamentally not possible if we look at a paper-based process. At the end of the day, in a paper-based process, we have file cabinets with pieces of signed paper and notes, but everything else is going to be fairly difficult to assess or understand or audit or get insight into. And through the transparency features that eConsent offers, we can look at things like right off the bat in real time, how many patients need to reconsent? Where are most of the questions coming from in this consent document? And maybe this would advise how we author that consent document, or we focus on being able to explain things more clearly on subsequent components. How many patients are consented to the correct version of a document, as well as even statistics in terms of comparing different language versions of documents. And at a detail level, for each subject, we can see incrementally everything that happened during a consent process. We can see how much time did they spend on one particular section versus another particular section. Are they rushing through the document? These are all things that we just have no real idea about in paper. And while on the one hand, perhaps from a legal perspective, that's a good thing, is to not have this visibility, I think from an ethical standpoint, as well as from a process improvement standpoint, I think it's really critical to understand that information. It's also important for us to understand the fact that we don't have incredibly great literacy. And this is showing U.S. statistics, but it's not that much better in other places in the world either. So according to a study that was done in, it was updated, I think, in 2013, but the statistics show us that as much as 14% of the U.S. population is illiterate, and that's 21%, so that's 1 in 5 of adults in the U.S. read below a 5th grade level, and that even 20% of high school students are illiterate. High school graduates are illiterate. So this tells us as well that we have to be careful when we're doing consent forms if people are saying that they understood or we think they understood, but ultimately, if we're depending upon their ability to read documents, which in some cases might require a postgraduate degree in research to be fully understood, do they really understand it? And it's likely that probably 1 in 5 don't. So we use a tool called the Flesch-Kincaid readability test, and we analyze the documents. And basically, you don't have to pay attention to this equation, but it basically looks at how long the words are, how many words have more than 3 syllables, how many of these longer words are in a particular sentence, and how many sentences have these. So it comes up with the basic syllables and words and sentences to come up with a 5th grade reading level or a 6th grade reading level, and we score it. And so we're able to analyze that in real time and look at these documents to understand their readability as we go through that process. So perhaps before we even consent a patient, we have something that might help us understand how hard a document is to read with some degree of independence or a transparency into that process. It's not 100%. It really only works in English, so it's not a perfect tool, but it does help us expose some perhaps incongruent elements of a consent form before we get in front and help advise that process. So let's jump over to eConsent and its effect on regulatory compliance in general. Depending on where we look, we're going to see anywhere from 7 to 15% of inspection and audit findings in general related to informed consent. Things as silly as lost documents or incorrect dates or signatures, signing the wrong version of a document, or the inability to demonstrate that consent was obtained at all. And so right off the bat, an eConsent solution can really help prevent this, or at least make it visible to a sponsor or a study team or a monitor before it becomes too late to make it possible to correct. Similarly, an eConsent tool gives us the ability to track documents. If you think about a study where we have 650 sites in 50 languages, and maybe we've had a couple of amendments over the course of 4 or 5 years, we're talking about thousands and thousands of documents. And the idea of managing those to be able to present historically, the whole path of all the versions of documents that a patient signed in a meaningful way is essentially impossible in a paper-based process, but is quite possible and quite feasible using common document management and version control tools that are available in an electronic informed consent system. Additionally, being able to demonstrate that a proper consent process took place, who did it? When did it happen? Did it happen before procedures happened? Were there questions? Were there answers? Elements like this. Again, all things that can happen during the course of an eConsent deployment. So to summarize, I'm going to leave a little bit of time for questions. I think it's clear that we can improve patient comprehension through the use of eConsent. There are other statistics that show improved patient satisfaction, and these things all point to reduced dropout rates and hopefully translate into reduced recruitment needs at the end of the day. So I'd like to go back at this point to Rachel and maybe open it up to questions. I also encourage you to email me and be happy to do some deeper dives or look at specific elements. You can also go to the DrugDev website, and there's quite a bit of information there as well. And again, I want to thank Ken and Rachel for their help with this, as well as everything else that they do.
Fantastic, Eric. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I want to thank both Ken and Eric really for your excellent presentations. We have gotten lots and lots of questions, which is fantastic. So I'm going to dive right into the Q&A session now. And Ken and Eric, if you want to unmute yourselves so that you can both just jump in to answer these questions, please feel free. I'm going to start with our first question here. There's a question about eConsent and multifaceted approach. What's your experience about with doing a quiz? Does adding a quiz make patients a little bit more stressed out during the process?
That's a great question. And I think it really depends on the nature of the quiz and how it's presented to the patient. Again, if we're giving that to the patient and it's clear to the patient that this is just for them and it's optional and it's a tool for them to help assess their own understanding as opposed to a test that they have to pass in order to enter or not, not be admitted to the trial. I think those are two sort of extreme elements and factors that have to be considered when we're looking at deploying a quiz or a self-assessment in the actual eConsent process. So there are quite a few different ways to do it. It also depends upon the study team's desire or appetite or how complex the form, but I think in general, it's possible to put a quiz in there and not have it increase the stress level, but obviously depending on how that's done, I think that's the key.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next question. This is from a psych. I would love to complete all of my consents via eConsent. However, isn't that a decision that's up to the sponsors of the study?
That's an interesting question. I mean, most of the time, the eConsent process it belongs to the sites. I think eConsent is new and perhaps cost prohibitive for a single smaller site to deploy, although we start to see more and more hospitals and hospital networks and larger sites adopting eConsent. I think sponsors typically are helping sites use eConsent systems because there are some benefits to them, but also they want to improve the overall process for the patients in their studies. If you look at the EU, the EMA, for example, really believes that consent belongs at the sites, and they would like to see this actually being done by sites. I think it's probably cost prohibitive. So I think the short answer is that if there's a site that wants to do eConsent, I don't think a sponsor is going to say, no, you can't use eConsent, you have to use paper. But ultimately, it's probably more of a question of logistics and feasibility from a cost perspective at this point.
Great. Next question. How much longer or shorter on average does an informed consent process with eConsent take?
That varies a little bit, but in general, the average for us, and I think we're starting our I think 110th study right now. On average, we see 20, maybe even a little bit less, at 17 to 28% increase in time on eConsent. But again, it really depends on how much multimedia we're doing, how long the videos are. Sometimes we use narrations, especially in situations where we have a visually impaired population, and so to listen to a narrator read a form will take longer. So in general, I'd say we average about 25% longer on an eConsent form. The benefit, the upside there is, though, that longer engagement, I think, translates into improved comprehension.
Excellent. Another question. How is eConsent adapted for language differences, and can it be adapted for reading or hearing differences?
It absolutely can. Our tool supports more than 50 languages. We can do right to left, top to bottom, multi-byte characters, and it's widely used in global studies where those kinds of things are important. So I think the number of languages are key. I think the second part of the question, can you repeat the second part of the question, Rachel? I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. Can it be adapted for reading or hearing differences?
Yes, it can. In fact, DrugDev eConsent was recognized in a study as the best patient-centric trial at the CARE Awards in Boston recently. And this was a study that was done with a population of geographic atrophy ARMD patients who were almost entirely blind. And in that study, we were able to use narration, sort of voiceover of the ICF content to deal with that particular element. And so what we found is that a number of these patients were just really, really grateful to be able to go through the consent form themselves, as opposed to having to have someone read it to them, and to be able to kind of go through that content on their own, as opposed to depending on someone else reading it to them. Similarly, we see tools, for there are patients who have demonstrated an inability to turn the page of a paper document, but they're able to go through the process on an iPad as a result of having rheumatoid arthritis or severe dysfunction in their hands where they can't actually turn the pages of a paper. So I think, in terms of blind patients or even deaf patients, it's very easy for us to exploit the capabilities of electronic technologies to make that experience easier for them, whether it's screen readers or enlarged fonts or elements like that.
Great. And a follow-up then to that about the patient, Eric, how is a patient provided a copy of their eConsent?
Great question. So the FDA in their guidance points out that, in their eConsent guidance, points out that it is acceptable to email a patient provided that we're using a secured email component. So just like anything, as long as we're working within the purview of HIPAA and ensuring we have patient privacy, and we're not using a public email address or a hackable kind of system, that it's possible to email a consent document to a patient. So this improves the likelihood of the patient being able to find that document, 4 or 5 months when they realize they have a question about the study. It's also possible, and sometimes it's interpreted, that we have to give them a paper copy of the signed version of the document. So it's also possible to print it out and give them a paper copy, depending on a site's SOPs or on the interpretation of the various laws. But it's possible to translate electronically in the U.S. I think, according to the privacy and security laws in different countries outside of the U.S., you have to apply to those elements. But increasingly, we're seeing the ability to email them as long as we're using a secured email system.
Fantastic. You mentioned that there's an FDA guidance. Somebody asked a question, what are the regulatory requirements for eConsent? So is there anything else to add to that?
Yeah, well, sure. There's 21 CFR Part 11, which describes electronic systems and any electronic systems and the quality systems and elements like that have to be followed. So yeah, there are definitely rules and regulations that have to be followed. That's probably something that could be its own 30-minute or 45-minute presentation. So I'd be happy to answer emails about that with a longer list if that makes sense, if that's helpful. Probably a little bit more than we can get through in 3 minutes. But there are definitely rules and regulations, and they're going to be country and regional specific.
Fantastic. Another sort of follow-up to that, to build on, in your experience, how have ethics committees reviewed eConsent? Are there any specific variations across the globe?
Yeah, I think most of the large central IRBs in the U.S. Recognize the benefits of eConsent and largely embrace it. Just like a paper document, they're going to object to referring to a clinical trial as being a treatment option, and that's obviously a different debate. So I think in cases we have smaller local IRBs, it's potentially they don't know what eConsent is and they're curious about it. But in our experience, we find both in smaller local IRBs in the U.S. as well as ethics committees around the world, that once they have an understanding of what eConsent does, they pretty quickly recognize that this is something that is done to help patients understand, and they pretty quickly agree that this is a good thing. And I'll say by and large, probably 1 in 50 or 60 different IRBs or ethics committees will ask questions. And of those, we can typically turn them around and get them to understand the benefits of eConsent and allow eConsent to happen. At least in some cases, maybe without electronic signatures, but they do recognize that it's good for the patients, and for the most part, the overwhelming majority will allow eConsent to take place once they understand it.
Great. Sorry, I know we only have about 1 more minute left, so I'm going to try to get through as many as I can. We have lots of questions here. How does a site obtain funding for the iPad or other tools, and what is the estimated cost?
Yeah, that really varies quite a bit. I mean, an iPad itself probably costs, you can buy a new iPad for about $400. And at the end of the day, though, the iPad is really just the device that's delivering that content. So, there are different tools that have different components. So if you're using the system in kind of a self-service model, then I think the costs are much, much lower. I think it's probably best for me to answer specific cost questions on a one-on-one if we understand some better parameters. But at a site level, the cost is not going to be that high compared to doing a global multinational study over 5 years. Obviously the cost is quite a bit higher.
Sure. Great. And that brings us to the close of our webinar. I'm very sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions. However, what we'll do is we'll take all of the questions that have been submitted offline, and we will try to address them via an email that will go out to all of the registered attendees to try to address the questions that we may have missed. Both Eric and Ken have provided their contact information here if you have any specific questions for them. You can also visit both of our websites if you have any questions. You can contact myself, Rachel Minnick, if you have any questions as well, and we'd be happy to answer those. But to kind of close, I want to thank today's speakers, Ken and Eric. Thank you so much for your informative presentations and your time. We also want to thank DrugDev for co-hosting this webinar with us. And finally, we certainly want to thank all of you for joining today's webinar. Again, you'll be receiving an email with instructions for how to access the recorded archive webinar. Again, you'll also receive an email to try to answer some of these questions that we were unable to get to live. But on behalf of CISCRP and DrugDev, I want to again thank you all so much and hope you all have a wonderful day.